Let me read to you a passage from the 8th chapter of St. Matthew's Gospel, verses 5 to 17. It's the Gospel for Saturday after the 12th Sunday of Ordinary Time. St. Matthew writes, "When Jesus had entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him, asking for help. 'Lord,' he said, 'my servant lies at home, paralyzed and in terrible suffering.' Jesus said to him, 'I will go and heal him.' The centurion replied, 'Lord, I do not deserve to have you come under my roof, but just say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I myself am a man under authority, with soldiers under me. I tell this one, go, and he goes, and that one, come, and he comes. I say to my servant, do this, and he does it.' When Jesus heard this, he was astonished, and said to those following him, 'I tell you the truth, I have not found anyone in Israel with such great faith. I say to you that many will come from the east and the west, and will take their places at the feast with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the subjects of the kingdom will be thrown outside into the darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth.' Then Jesus said to the centurion, 'Go, it will be done just as you have believed.' And his servant was healed at that very hour. When Jesus came into Peter's house, he saw Peter's mother-in-law lying in bed with a fever. He touched her hand, and the fever left her, and she got up and began to wait on him. When evening came, many who were demon-possessed were brought to him, and he drove out the spirits with a word and healed all the sick. This was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah. He took up our infirmities and carried our diseases." That's from Matthew chapter 8, verses 5 to 17. It suggests thoughts about the Gentiles. What do I mean? Well, our Lord did make some observations about the Gentiles. For instance, he predicted sufferings for his disciples among the Gentiles. He said, "You will be dragged before governors and kings for my sake, to bear witness before them and the Gentiles." Matthew chapter 10, verse 17 to 18. He compared how the 12 were to exercise authority with the lordly way the Gentiles exercised it. "You know," he said, "that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great men exercise authority over them. It shall not be so among you, but whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be your slave, even as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve." Matthew chapter 20, verse 25 to 28. As the time of his public ministry advanced, our Lord at various times spoke of his coming sufferings and death, and he sharply rebuked Simon Peter for attempting to dissuade him from this path. Matthew chapter 16, verse 24. This divinely intended course would be effected at the hands of the Gentiles. We read, "And as he was going up to Jerusalem, he took the 12 disciples aside, and on the way he said to them, 'The chief priests and scribes will deliver him to the Gentiles to be mocked and scourged and crucified.' Matthew chapter 20, verse 17 to 19. Nevertheless, the Gentiles seem more kindly treated in the Gospels than might be expected, and certainly more kindly spoken of than various ones of the Jewish authorities. There are no words by Christ on the Roman occupation, and certainly none about Caesar himself. Indeed, he told the Jewish authorities that in respect to the odious Roman taxation, they were to render to Caesar what belongs to Caesar. He cast no aspersions on the effigy of the emperor that stamped the coins in Jewish circulation. Matthew chapter 22, verse 20 to 21. He was often kind in his references to the tax collectors who served the Romans in this capacity, and even called one of them to be among the very 12. When our Lord was delivered up to the Gentiles, he is portrayed as calm, strong, and silent before false accusations, but he is respectful to Pilate himself and answers in simple fashion Pilate's interrogation about his person. Chapter 27, verse 11 to 14. Pilate comes through as weak, but he recognizes the innocence and perhaps the moral stature of the man before him. Certainly his wife, a Gentile, did. Luke chapter 27, verse 19. Though Pilate crumbled and condemned Jesus to death, Christ declared his to be the lesser guilt. John chapter 19, verse 11. The general impression is that there was a certain goodness out there among the Gentiles. It was by no means all bad. Our Lord holds up before the scribes and Pharisees the example of the men of Nineveh who repented at the preaching of Jonah the prophet. Matthew chapter 12, verse 41. When he withdrew to the region of Tyre and Sidon, a Canaanite woman there came after him, insistently pleading for her daughter. She would not let up till she gained her request. She knew our Lord could do it and that he was holy. She won from our Lord high praise. O woman, great is your faith. Matthew chapter 15, verse 28. She was a Gentile. At the most terrible moment of all, when Jesus Christ expired dead on the cross, Matthew informs us that the earth shook. The centurion attending the crucifixion perceived the direct connection between the death of the man before them and this natural phenomenon. Matthew writes that the centurion and those who were with him were filled with awe and said, truly this was the, or a, Son of God. Matthew chapter 27, verse 54. In Mark, it is just the centurion who says this. Mark chapter 15, verse 39. In Luke, the centurion declares Christ's innocence. Chapter 23, verse 47. All this brings us to our gospel that I read earlier from Matthew chapter 8, verse 5 to 17, and may serve as something of a context for it. The gospel I read is from Matthew, and in Matthew's account of the incident, when our Lord entered Capernaum, we read, a centurion came forward to him, beseeching him and saying, Lord, my servant is lying paralyzed and in terrible distress. That is all he does. He just presents the request or the need, just as Mary, the mother of Christ, simply presented her request to Jesus at the wedding feast of Cana. They have no wine. Inasmuch as Mary's prayer is a model of simple petition, we have every reason to regard the centurion's prayer as excellent too in its faith-filled simplicity. Christ's response was immediate. He did not simply utter a word of healing from a distance, but offered to accompany the centurion to his dwelling, perhaps as a sign of personal regard and encouragement. But the centurion was too humble to admit of that great honour, and immediately declared his unworthiness. Lord, I am not worthy to have you under my roof, but only say the word and my servant will be healed. His faith evoked the highest praise from Christ, and with a prediction that other Gentiles would follow. Let the disciples of Christ learn from this to esteem those not yet possessing the grace of discipleship. Matthew's Gospel ends not with an account of the ascension to the right hand of the Father, but with Christ's great commission to his disciples to go and make disciples of all nations, which is to say, to all the Gentiles. They were to go to the ends of the earth, and implicitly to the emperor himself, and declare that all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. All were to become subjects of Jesus Christ, and to be baptized in the name of the one and triune God. Matthew chapter 28, verse 18 to 20. There was no mission more daunting, but good hearts were out there, and they are there still for us to reach. The world of everyday life awaits the word of the gospel.